Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Lujan. I'm ROM's Associate Curator of Fishes. Just to check video, is everyone everyone getting the signal through? Great. Well, I'm delighted you could join us today for our Curator conversation. This is a digital program that explores themes and subjects from ROM collections alongside industry professionals. I'm especially excited about today's conversation because of our guest, Dr. Nick Mandrak, and because this is really the first major launch event for ROM's newly re-released Field Guide to the Fishes of Ontario, which we'll delve into later. Well, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. During today's program, you can submit questions for us via the Q&A feature on the screen, and later in the conversation, we'll get to some of those Q&A questions, and the ones we don't get to, we'll address via correspondence later on. In celebration of ROM's release of this beautiful new revised field guide to the fishes of Ontario, I really wanted to sit down with one of the book's co-authors to discuss the important role that field guides play in our interactions with and our understanding of the natural world. And I think we're all really fortunate that Nick, or Dr. Nick Mandrak, has agreed to join us. So Dr. Mandrak, who I'm fortunate to know as Nick, is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and is director of UTSC's Professional Master's Program in Conservation and Biodiversity. His research and that of his students examines the biogeography, the biodiversity, and the conservation of freshwater fishes, particularly endangered and invasive species here in Canada. So Nick is a research associate of the ROM's Fish Division. He has a close connection to the ROM and a long history of working here. And he's also an associate of the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. He's co-authored more than 300 scientific articles, reports, and books, including a few recent papers co-authored with me. And then, of course, this amazing new field guide to the fishes of Ontario, which Nick co-authored with Erling Holm and Mary Burridge, two long-time assistant curators here in the ROM's Fish Division. Welcome to the conversation, Nick.
Thanks, Nathan.
Well, it's good to see you again. I don't know if you remember this, but you and I met for the first time just shy of about 8 years ago while wandering through the Tennessee Aquarium at the Ichthyology and Herpetology Congress in Chattanooga. Appropriately enough, a freshwater-focused public aquarium. Our mutual friend, Nate Lovejoy, also a professor at UTSC, introduced us. And for a few years after that, Nick hired me to work as a postdoc in his lab, and we did some good research together on the genomic history and population structure of Great Lakes fishes. One of the things that drew me to Nick's lab was that it was just full of fish heads, folks who just can't stop studying and hearing about and talking about fishes. And Nick is one of those fish heads. Well, Nick, in terms of your history with fishes and your fascination with fishes and field guides, especially the topic of today's conversation, are there any field guides that were influential to you when you were a child or growing up, or that have been influential throughout your career?
Well, there have been a few, Nathan. I grew up in Mississauga, and I clearly remember the first time I went fishing with my father. I was in grade 1, and we had hooked this big fish, and my father thought it was a salmon, so he walked into the water and he lifted out this huge white sucker. As soon as I saw that fish, that was it. I was, sorry, pardon the pun, hooked on fishes. I went straight to the school library and I found the Golden Field Guide to fishes, and the Golden Guides were produced in the 1960s, and they were little like 3 by 5 inch guides that just showed you the diversity of whatever taxonomic group they were on. But this Golden Field Guide was the thing that really turned me on. I couldn't stop looking at it. And I have one I have that same one to this day in my book collection, and I remember it fondly. And I just want to fast forward a few years. When I was 11 or 12 years old, my neighbor went to University of Guelph, and he brought home Don McAllister and E.J. Crossman's Sport Fishes of Canada field guide. And then I realized, wow, there's one for Canada, and it included all these sport fishes, and I absolutely devoured it. And then the next book that my neighbor brought home was Scott and Crossman's Freshwater Fishes of Canada, the Bible, and more than a field guide, but the Bible to Canadian freshwater fishes that will be 50 years old next year.
Awesome. Yeah, when I grew up, I'm originally from Tennessee, from the southern United States, and there and ranging up into Canada is this amazing group of fishes called darters. These little, really colorful fishes that bop around on the bottom. And the field guides that I remember most fondly from youth were Larry Page's The Handbook of Darters, and then this The American Darters by Kuhn and Barber. And I would just pore over these field guides with all these detailed descriptions of fishes, these photographs of fishes that I'd never seen before, and remember staying up late at night with a flashlight in bed, till after lights out, just reading about the details of each species and what makes those species distinct. I mean, it was just I just couldn't get enough of it. What in your mind? What are the characteristics that make for a good field guide?
Well, I think you actually showed it when you just showed us a bit of that darter book. Of course, images, right? And I can understand why you were enthralled with the darters, because they are sort of our North American version of tropical fishes. They're so colorful, but certainly images. And it's the images in that golden field guide, looking at these weird and wonderful fishes, and not just barely comprehending the absolute diversity in the forms of fishes. So I think a good field guide has a lot of images and illustrations. That's because I think that's what initially catches our eyes, particularly us at a young age. The two of us at a young age, where we may not have fully comprehended the content of the books, but the images are what really captured me.
Absolutely. And the images in this new field guide are amazing. So let's take a look. Aaron, if you want to bring up those first page proofs. So this is the cover of the book, of course. I flashed that earlier. And then the next one. Awesome. So here we see some sunfish, some fishes that a species profile for the northern sunfish, one that some of the audience members might be familiar with. And then go to the next one. This one I really love, the rosy face shiner profile, especially these photos on the right side of it of the species in its natural habitat, and what appears to be a spawning photo with the males or a male-male competition there. Really beautiful fish here that we have in southern Ontario.
And Nathan, the interesting thing about the books and the photos is when we wrote the first version of the book, it was quite difficult to find underwater photographs, and people were only just starting to do it. And my first position was in Kansas, and there happened to be a really good underwater photographer in Kansas, and that made me think, there must be images out there of a lot of the species that occur in Canada. And we made a decision very early on that we wanted to get as many underwater shots as possible. And 10 years ago, well, quite frankly, probably 15 years ago, when we started looking for images, underwater images, there were not a lot to choose from. And that's the one thing that's exploded over the last decade. So the one thing readers will notice if they compare the first and second edition is there are a lot more really high quality underwater images. And we worked hard to look for additional images because the hobby has really exploded in the last decade or so.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the challenges of freshwater fish appreciation. Freshwaters, unfortunately, are not as oftentimes don't have as clear water as reefs, where people are used to seeing underwater photographs of brilliant reef fishes. And I think that contributes to people's misunderstanding or poor understanding of freshwater diversity, just that inability to snorkel, see these things underwater. And you really have to be selective to try to find the good habitats with clear water to get those underwater photos. Well,
Yeah,
these beautiful, what's that?
and I like to say out of sight, out of mind.
Sure.
So what we're trying to do here is get them in with insight, so people can appreciate it. And in the book we also explain how you can appreciate fish viewing in the wild through snorkeling or photography, collecting and using special little fish viewing devices to better appreciate fishes. So we do have a section in the book that explains that as well.
Yeah, and Southern Ontario really is still blessed with a number of clear water streams where you can go with a snorkel and a mask, and if it's cold, maybe a wetsuit, get out there and enjoy these fishes in their natural habitat. You don't even have to be a fisherman. You can just appreciate those fishes, and it's especially in the summertime when it's warm, it can be a wonderful, relaxing activity. Well, looking at these species profiles reminds me again of my childhood fascination with the details of individual species and what makes them distinct and their natural histories, their ecologies. What are some other aspects of this book that you think children especially might enjoy or find useful?
Well, again, I have to go back to the images, right? They may not be able to, young children may not be able to, fully understand all the text, but I mean, we literally have hundreds and hundreds of images here. And I would not be surprised if there are over 100 new images in the second edition. Sorry, I don't have the count in front of me, but just to see, like I did when I was young, to see that diversity by just flipping through the pages, and you're like, really? When I drive over a stream in the car with my parents, those might actually be in that stream. That's what I thought, my entire childhood. That's what I was thinking. What's in that stream? And I imagined that it would be, some of those fishes that I saw in the Golden Guide, although there were not many Ontario fishes in it, or in the other guides that I subsequently read as a kid.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the key to the fascination with fishes, is that it's just this whole other world that you're passing by and that exists there waiting to be explored.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of other members of the audience, what might people with cottages or fishermen or just general naturalists might find useful in this book?
Well, I think they can more fully explore the book, right? And refine their identification skills to identify all the species they capture. I was sitting on my dock a few years ago at my cabin just outside of Algonquin Park, and a couple of kids rode over with a fish, and they said, "We caught this in our minnow trap. We have no idea what it is." And our parents said, "Oh, there's a fish guy who lives across the lake. Why don't you take it to him?" And it was a burbot, typically a deep water species, a small one that had migrated into the shallows probably at night to feed, but it's a freshwater cod. They could have forgone the rowing across the lake if they had just picked up our field guide and flipped through it. So I really think it targets a general audience. We want the general public to be able to readily use this. So I think cottagers who are interested in exploring the diversity, those who use iNaturalist, take photographs of terrestrial organisms all the time. Well, you can do this. You can also do that when you catch something by angling or in a minnow trap, and then try to identify it using our guide. Fishermen may want to identify species that might be not native or illegal to use as bait, so that they know not to use them, or they may simply want to identify their catch. And keep in mind, citizen scientists, like we have many of them in the general public, for example, those using iNaturalist, can be looking out for native species that are found in an unusual place outside of their range as identified in our maps, or invasive species that are not known from their area. They can go to our guide and quickly determine what the species is. And if they can't, the guide can guide them to where they can find out the identification of the species. And you can see the example here of, there are some characteristics that we need to understand when we're identifying fishes. And we have this figure of anatomical characteristics that are used in the book. Pretty straightforward once you get comfortable with them. And then, if you catch a fish, what you do is you go to the guide, you go to the comparative photograph section where you see a whole bunch of fishes, and you say which one you determine which one your fish looks most like, and then you go to the actual account for the fish, and that account describes the characteristics of the fish, and then also explains how it differs from similar fishes. So that's how you can use the guide simply. And it's not, we know that biologists use it all the time. And it's meant to be, it's set up in a user-friendly format. So you go to the similar species pages that look like this. You figure out what your fish looks like, and then you confirm it by going to the species account. And again, you can see on the screen the explanation of the characteristics that we use. So if you read the species account and you find a characteristic that you're uncertain of, if it's bolded, there is a glossary that explains what it is. And then also there are these figures at the front of the book that are visual descriptions of these characters as well. And we've tried to do our best to avoid as much sort of scientific jargon as possible, because we do want to make the book accessible to everyone.
Yeah, that challenge of proper identification reminds me of early in my projects working in your lab, when I'd received these boxes of fin clips from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And these were specimens that had been collected and identified by professional biologists. And in some cases, especially with the suckers, the red horses, the greater and the shorthead red horse, I'd have to wait until I got the DNA information, and the DNA would tell me that in some cases these were misidentified individuals, that they were one species or the other. And that just illustrates, that even for a professional, mistakes are possible, and it is challenging to identify some species of fish. I think here we're seeing the minnow pages, minnows being one of the most diverse groups in Ontario, and one of the more challenging groups to identify. And I think this book, one of the strengths of this book are these beautiful guides, really well illustrated guides that highlight the distinct features that allow you to distinguish between potentially confusing fish species.
And the one thing I'll point out is that a lot of these characteristics come particularly from Erling Holm, the senior author, who has like a 40-year history, 40-plus year history of looking at, probably at this point, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ontario fishes. Literally, I'm not kidding. And Erling is the expert on fish identification in Ontario. And, over the years, he has compiled a lot of these characteristics based on seeing a lot of individuals. So, these characters and the way we've set up in the book is a real testament and reflection of Erling's extensive knowledge of these species.
And you mentioned iNaturalist. Are there other ways in which audience members can use the book to contribute to conservation or a scientific understanding of Ontario's fishes?
Yeah, well, I think those that are interested in the diversity of fishes, if they're in any given area, say for example their cottage, they should become familiar with what species they might expect to see at their cottage, and they can confirm that by looking at the maps in our field guide. And they end up catching species that appear to be outside of their range based on the map. They should report it, and they can report it to iNaturalist. They can If it's an invasive species, they can report it to the invading species hotline. And I think a lot of the changes in the maps that we've made over the last 10 years is related to individuals reporting new records outside of of either invasive or native species outside of their known range based on our previous guide. So, get to know what fishes you might expect in your locations and habitats. And we have a habitat section as well for each of the species, so that you will know whether or not you would expect the species in, for example, a lake or a river, at whereabouts in the lake, shallow, deep, and so on. That information is provided in the guide. So my suggestion for those who are really keenly interested in exploring fish biodiversity and becoming a citizen scientist is that they get to know what species to expect so that they can identify the unexpected. Yeah. And then they can report it to iNaturalist or the invading species hotline or to us through the ROM.
Absolutely. So that raises this issue of invasive and non-native species, which of course are a huge concern throughout the Great Lakes. Could you explain the difference between a non-native and an invasive species? Are these concepts interchangeable?
Well, not really. So, first of all, we have native species. Native species are those that we believe have survived in Canada, or in our case, Ontario, more or less since the end of the last ice age. So immediately following the melting of the glaciers, those species use the meltwaters to disperse back into Canada, and have more or less been where they're found now for the last 3,000 to 5,000 years, when modern day watersheds were formed. And then species that have been introduced more recently, essentially since European colonization, are considered to be non-native. If they, we distinguish between those that are established and reproducing and those that are not established. That is, maybe we found a piranha once or twice in Ontario, but there are no known reproducing populations. Then we have to distinguish between non-native and invasive. So an invasive species is typically a non-native species that has demonstrable negative impacts on native species or ecosystems. So we use the term non-native for any species that is not native to Canada. We use the term invasive for those non-native species that we believe are having a negative impact to native species or ecosystems. So the good example is this one right here in front of us. This many people would think it ugly. I find it fascinating. The Ste Lamprey, which got into the Great Lakes in the 1800s by moving through some canals that joined the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast, and then moved from Lake Ontario into the upper Great Lakes, likely through the Welland Canal when it was completed in the late 1800s.
So just briefly, we've got two more slides here. The next one is a Tinch. Could you just briefly explain why people might need to be concerned about Tinch?
So Tinch is an interesting one because in our first edition, Tinch was identified as a potential invader. In our current edition, unfortunately, it's identified as a species now established in Ontario. And we're going to quibble on that a little bit because we do not yet know that it's reproducing in Ontario. It has been found in Ontario, but it is reproducing in the St. Lawrence River, more or less up to the Ontario border. So there's no doubt that very soon Tinch will be reproducing in Ontario. Therefore, we decided to include it as established in Ontario. I'm going to explain this a little further in the book. But interestingly, Tinch, 30 Tinch were introduced into a pond in the Richelieu River in Quebec in the 1980s. They were subsequently released from that pond. We don't know if it was accidentally through flooding or deliberately by a disgruntled farmer who didn't make his $1 million raising Tinch. And then the Richelieu River is connected to the St. Lawrence River. they made it into the St. Lawrence River, and for 20 or 30 years, they were found in very low numbers. Within the last 10 years, their numbers have exploded in the St. Lawrence River, and they're very, very abundant. And as a result, they've been dispersing, moving relatively quickly upstream, which, keep in mind, is to the southwest, upstream towards Lake Ontario, into warmer waters that are probably even more suitable for it. So we expect tench to become very abundant in the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario if nothing is done. And this is the reason why we include it in the second edition field guide as established in Ontario, because if it's not yet established, it soon will be.
Yeah. I'd like to leave some room for questions. There's a final slide here that deals with carps, and I don't see any immediate questions in the chat, but if people have questions and for Nick or for me, please insert those in the chat. And I'd like to just conclude with this topic of carps. And carps are one of the areas in which there are a lot of changes from the last field guide to this field guide. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit why
Sure.
carps are suddenly so confusing.
Yeah, well, so what, several things have changed in the last 10 years, between field guide editions, and taxonomy of fishes is constantly evolving. And so taxonomy of Ontario fishes has changed as well. And the carps are one example. So 10 years ago, carps and minnows were included in one family, the Cyprinidae family, the carps and minnow family. Since then, that family has been divided into 4 families, of which 3 of which are found in Ontario. Well, let's say 2 of which are found in Ontario, and 2 of which we expect to be established in Ontario in the very near future. So Cyprinidae is now restricted to common carp, the carp that we see commonly in southern Ontario, which is an invasive species. And this goldfish are also found in this family, and goldfish are becoming increasingly more abundant, likely as the result of climate change in southern Ontario. And this is something that we're studying in my lab as well. But then the minnows, the native minnows, have been moved to a different family, Leuciscidae. And then on top of it, tench used to be in the Cyprinidae family, and tench is now in its own family. It's a family that only contains one living species, Tinca tinca, the tench. And that's the species we just talked about, that where its establishment in Ontario is imminent. And the 4th family is for those carps formerly known as Asian carps, those invasive carps that you may know it to be those jumping carps like the silver carp, and then there's the bighead carp, black carp, and grass carp, these 4 highly invasive species that are spreading northward into the Great Lakes Basin. And the grass carp, for example, is reproducing on the American side of Lake Erie, and will undoubtedly end up reproducing on the Canadian side in the very near future. And its family is known as Xenocyprinidae. So because of changing taxonomy, based both on morphology and genetics, we now see that this one minnow family, Cyprinidae, in our first edition is now 4 families, and we recognize them as 4 separate families in the second edition. Great,
That's great. So going to some of the questions, Emily Postoraro asked if we could speak to the advantages, disadvantages of photographs in field guides as opposed to illustrations. Was this part of the discussion that you had with your co-authors?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because when you look at Scott and Crossman's Freshwater Fishes of Canada, they're very detailed, anatomically correct illustrations, but they don't capture the color, right? And so we thought that was a strike against them. And then there's some amazing artists in North America that actually do color illustrations, color scientific illustrations of North American freshwater fishes. And we considered those as well. But in the end, we thought, what better to represent the fishes themselves, in photograph form, and you'll see that we have portraits where we've clipped the portrait to just the body itself at the beginning of the species account. Most of those images are taken out of water, but with live specimens treated humanely while being photographed. And then we have the underwater shots to show what you might expect to see if you view them underwater, and also to show some variation in them. So we considered the illustrations, but we felt that photographs themselves best represented the species.
Right. Another question from Jeremy Pearson. Are there extinct or extirpated species in the new field guide from Southern Ontario?
Yes, there are. We do have an extirpated section, and it includes, the main one that it includes is, well, I'm thinking that there's two, gravel chub and paddlefish. Gravel chub was found at 2 locations in the Thames River, but not since the 1950s, and not for the lack of looking for them. And paddlefish, these are the fish that get to be, 2 meters long and have this long snout up to, 1 meter long, have not been seen in the Great Lakes since the 1800s. So we do have a short section at the back of the book on them, so that people know that these species did occur in Ontario in the past.
Yeah. To that same point, of course, there are these fishes that are disappearing, and then the invasive species that are coming in, and I think that that illustrates why fish communities as a whole might be changing. Are there other changes in fish species populations related to changes in water quality or temperatures that are being observed in Ontario?
Well, I think climate change is the big one, the big driver of changes in basically fish distributions, right? So we certainly, in Ontario, we have upwards of 40 of our, 150 species or so that are listed as at risk by COSEWIC. And that's primarily as the result of habitat destruction that has occurred in the past, largely in the past, overexploitation that has occurred in the past.
Yeah.
But I think that, the emerging threat is climate change.
Yeah.
And climate change is going to influence distributions of fishes in Ontario. It will likely result in some fishes that are found in the United States migrating into the Great Lakes, for example, and then into Canada. And I think flathead catfish is probably a good example of that. Flathead catfish in our 2010 guide was identified as a potential invader. In 2018, Fisheries and Oceans Canada found evidence of reproduction in the Thames River in southwestern Ontario. So now it's established in Canada, and we've put it in as an invader. We think that flathead catfish, the flathead catfish will be in with the rest of the catfishes. To answer that question that just came up. But we believe that it's expanding its range into Canada as a result of climate change. Some of the research that I've been doing in my lab with my grad students have shown that we think that some of the sunfishes are becoming more abundant, and as a result, they're feeding on minnows, and some of those minnows which are endangered are becoming less abundant. For example, pug-nosed shiner in eastern Ontario and southwestern Ontario appear to be ending up becoming prey to these sunfishes that are increasing in abundance as the result of climate change.
Yeah. Thank you to Anne Marriott for that question. And Miss Hugh Sam asks, how many species of fish exist in Ontario?
Well, I better check at the in the book. I said 150. Well, actually, I am right. 150. My memory does not fail me. 129 native species and 21 established introduced species or non-native species. So 150.
And it sounds like invasive species are outpacing extinctions currently, and that number is likely to increase.
Oh, absolutely. And we've shown this. We've actually published a paper that showed the intersection between extirpations and invasions, and the invasions are definitely outpacing the extinctions, which is good. It's good for the native species, but but not good for the invasive species.
Yeah. So a good question, just to really hammer it down for folks, is what are the changes between the first edition and the second edition? And besides the images, particularly when it comes to species identifications, what changes can folks who have the first edition expect to find in the new edition?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna have, despite you saying despite the photographs, I'm gonna have to emphasize that because we spent a lot of time tracking down photographs to add to the experience. Yeah. So lots of new photographs, updated maps. We've discussed the changes in taxonomy for the most part. The one other one I want to point out is that the family Umbridae, the central mud minnow family, is now found within the family Asocidae, the pike family. So it's now the pikes and mud minnow family. Where there's been new biological information on the species, we've changed the text. And in Ontario, that has come largely as the result of additional research that has been done by DFO, the ROM, and academics such as my lab on endangered species. We've totally revised our maximum and record size tables, so they're updated. I think those are like what you'd expect. There are substantial changes. It took us about 2 years of working, on a weekly basis. 2 years to update the guide. In comparison, it actually took us about 5 years to write the first edition, and that was in part because I had a full-time job elsewhere, and so we would dedicate 1 day a week to reviewing what we had written the week before, and we did that over about a 5-year period, and we more or less did the same thing this time around, but it did take 2 years. I thought, a few updates, a couple of months maybe, but no, it is an extensive revision.
Great. And I'm sure, there were probably a few errors in the first edition that you noticed and corrected on. Yeah,
not just us. Our readers also noticed, and were, of course, made us aware of that. And of course, we encourage readers to do so for the next edition.
Absolutely. Read the book carefully and send your comments to Nick.
I think you should send them to the senior author, Erling.
Yeah, Erling's retired now. Erling recently retired from the ROM, and he has lots of time on his hands to handle these issues. Let's see, what are some other questions folks are asking? Why not include size and weight ranges with the photos? And how big do pikes grow in Ontario?
Well, we don't include them with the photos because we don't necessarily have that information. In fact, for most species, that information is not reported. And I would say, there is no one standard for taking fish photographs, like there is, for example, cataloging, actual specimens into a museum collection, where there's greater rigor in terms of the data that's reported. So that's the main reason we do not include that information with the actual photographs. And the question about pike, I think pike grow, the Ontario record off the top of my head is probably around 40 pounds, 42 pounds, something like that. Yeah. Typical pike would be under 5 pounds if you're just angling. Yeah. In Ontario.
Thanks, Imlin Koster, for that question. And then a question from Nelson Zabel. To what extent are hybrids covered in the guide, such as dace hybrids like northern red belly and fine scale dace?
Well, one of my pet groups going back to my graduate days, because I just found it fascinating. We don't really explain how to identify most hybrids because it's just too difficult to do so. but we do talk about, in particular, the northern red belly fine scale dace hybrids, because guess what? Some of them are clones, right? There are very few clones in vertebrates, and we have a good example of one of those very few examples here in Ontario, and largely occurring in Algonquin Park.
Okay, interesting.
I do see an email here about photographing small fishes. We do cover off how to do that in the field guide. So there's information on that in the field guide.
Great. And maybe a couple good questions to close on. What is your favorite fish that you talked about today, or favorite fish in the field guide? Let's open it up to the favorite fish of Ontario.
Well, okay. Well, I was actually out in the field looking at it yesterday at Rondo Provincial Park. That is spotted gar. Spotted gar is endangered in Canada. It's only found at 3 locations: Long Point Bay, Rondo Bay, and Point Pelee. In Rondo Bay has the best population, about 9,000 individuals. They're just an absolutely beautiful fish. We have some great shots of them in the field guide, including shots taken by a former PhD student who was studying them. And there are species that you can actually see from shore. So for example, we say bring binoculars when you go fish viewing. You can see gar because they get up to 3/4 of a meter long. You can see them with the naked eye, but using binoculars allows you to see them close up and just how strikingly beautiful their patterns are on their body. So I would say spotted gar.
Yeah, mine is still the darters. And the rainbow darter here in Southern Ontario. It's hard to find a more beautiful fish than a colored up rainbow darter, and that's one you could really enjoy snorkeling. You put on a mask and snorkel, get out into shallow waters and mini streams in Southern Ontario. If you've got kind of a rocky bottom, these little colorful fishes are just bopping around at the bottom. They're very inquisitive. They kind of move around and can move their head back and forth and look under rocks. They're usually out hunting, and this time of year it's a great activity to get outside and get into the streams and actually enjoy some of the behaviors in addition to just the different species that are going on underwater.
So Nathan, it was interesting that you said that. I had a PhD student who defended her thesis last week, and there was a professor from another university who is called the external examiner, and the first thing he asked her is, have you ever put on a snorkel and gone and actually looked at the behavior of your species?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one thing to see the pictures in our field guide, which I think are extraordinary, but it's another thing to actually go and see the fishes firsthand underwater. Just observe what they're doing. They're feeding, they're interacting with others, they're hiding from the bigger fish and so on. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. And then you see correspondences between their morphology, different morphologies, the way fishes are shaped, their body shape, their color patterns corresponds to their behavior in many respects. And you start to see these relationships in nature, the reasons why biodiversity looks the way it does, and there are the way these different species interact with each other. It's a wonderful activity that we can do, enjoying these clearer streams that remain in Southern Ontario.